Welcome back to another episode of Physiology Unraveled. I am your host, Jorge Granados, here with my co-host, Dr. Joe Watso. Today we're joined by Dr. Dustin Joubert. He's an applied exercise physiologist, lifelong runner, director of the Endurance Performance Lab, and associate professor at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. In this episode, we explore the science behind the super shoe, how advanced footwear technology influences your running economy and endurance performance, and what this actually means if you're chasing a PR or just now getting into running. By the end of the episode, you'll understand what the super shoe can and cannot do for your endurance performance, and you'll also gain practical advice in choosing your next running shoe without having to get lost in the marketing. Let's jump into the conversation with Dr. Joubert. Dustin Joubert, thanks for joining us on the podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of what your current role is and what drove you into doing this super shoe or advanced footwear technology research that you've been doing the past few years.
Yeah, thanks guys. Happy to chat with you all today. So I'm a lifelong runner. I'm an applied exercise physiologist. So I think going back to like high school days when I was a serious runner and going off to run in college, I was always a student of my sport and wanted to know how to get faster. I should have been more focused on how not to get injured, but so how to get faster kind of took me towards the physiology end of things. And so I pursued that, through a PhD and got my PhD from Texas A&M and got a lot of good hands-on skills, like an applied exercise lab, testing human subjects, more from a health standpoint at that time. But kind of once I got out on my own, my first faculty position was able to kind of focus my research on endurance exercise performance. And that's kind of where I've been for 10, 11 years now as an academic. Currently, I'm an associate professor at University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And so I do research on endurance performance, mostly distance runners. And in the last several years, that's taken me down the path of the impact of these so-called super shoes on running economy.
Thank you for that intro. And he's being humble, by the way, guys. He's a very, I would consider you an elite runner. So yeah, but anyway, let me share my screen here, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what this super shoe or the footwear technology that you're going to be discussing, and kind of what makes that difference compared to shoes maybe a decade or two ago. Well, do you remember when the first super shoe came out? What, like 2017, 2016, something like that?
Yeah, story basically starts 2016 Rio Olympics, when you've got the three men who are on the podium at the Rio Olympic marathon are all in this new Nike prototype super shoe. And pretty much the only guys in the field that have that shoe. And so that's really the start of the storyline. And shortly after that, you've got the first Nike paper that came out from Walter Hochhammer's group with 4% running economy benefits. So yeah, it's a relatively short history in terms of the academic lit, which really boomed a lot in the last 5 years in terms of development of the shoes and investigators researching the shoes. But yeah, so for decades before, you've got a shoe as a shoe. It's more or less just kind of EVA midsole foam, nothing super special really from a racing standpoint. The focus was always on lighter is better, because when you look at running economy, there's about a 1% increase in energy costs for every 100 grams of a shoe. It's kind of the dogma. And so the focus on racing shoes had always been on just light. So, you had a thin midsole of this EVA foam and a little bit of rubber outsole, and trying to keep the shoe kind of as light as possible. But yeah, this Nike shoe that was developed a little over 10 years ago, well, about 10 years ago now. Yeah. Had this new foam. That's really been the biggest change in this advanced footwear technology, or so-called super shoes, is the midsole foam is from different compounds that are more compliant. So compliance is sort of the opposite of stiffness. When you load a material, if it's compliant, it'll deform under load. And you can think of that as storing potential energy. Now that's only useful if it's also resilient, which is the case that it bounces back and returns that energy, right? So these new foams under load are very compliant, so they store energy, but then they're highly resilient. They return most of the energy you put into them. And so that's kind of been where the biggest material engineering advancement has been in these shoes, is in the midsole foams. And so one of those materials used now is PEBA, or polyether block amide. It's kind of the chemical soup that gets foamed out. Yeah, and so that's kind of been the bigger advancement. And it's also very lightweight, the foam, so they could use more of it and didn't have to worry about stripping the shoe down as much to get it lightweight. And the idea being more of this squishy, bouncy foam better. At least up to a point. And then the other big thing you see in these super shoes is some sort of stiffening element embedded into the foam, which is typically like a carbon fiber plate. So this lightweight carbon fiber plate that adds longitudinal bending stiffness to the shoe, but also probably a lot of the focus initially in this kind of story was on the carbon plate. Everybody was just like calling them carbon plated shoes, and let's make a carbon plated shoe by every company. That was their initial quest. And that was probably like the wrong focus. It's that foam tech that's been the bigger advancement. But the carbon plate, it does do a little bit, probably biomechanically. It stiffens the shoe longitudinally, and it reduces work at like the big toe and maybe at the ankle from that standpoint. But probably more importantly, it helps to like interact with more of the foam and stabilize the shoe, so you're not on this just big like wobbly bed of foam. So those would be the two big elements. The other thing you see with the shoes nowadays is like a more rocker profile. Like on the toe, it's not just totally flat, which like old school racing flats were called flats for that reason. Okay. So those would be kind of the three elements: new foam, a stiffening element, and
is that what you're talking about? I have no idea. I use them, but
like when you toe off. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so those are three elements, and then so this translates into, as you were saying, the first initial paper, a 4% improved running economy. And so for those that are not familiar with running economy, can you give us a brief description, kind of high level overview on what it is and why it's important for us to test that?
Yeah. So if you kind of backtrack and think about like determinants of endurance exercise performance, or in this case, running performance, you kind of got like the three big physiological determinants or predictors have been VO2 max. So like someone's maximal aerobic capacity dictates, maximum amount of oxygen they consume, ATP they can produce aerobically, and is important. It's kind of their ceiling for their aerobic engine, right? But people can't exercise at their VO2 max for prolonged periods of time. So we also know that an athlete's like lactate threshold is important, because that sort of dictates the percentage of their VO2 max that's sustainable, what is like a sustainable physiological intensity they can do for these prolonged endurance events. And then if you have this sustainable physiological intensity, the last bit is how fast you go at that sustainable physiological intensity. And that's essentially what exercise economy tells us, is at a given physiological intensity, how fast do you move? The way a lot of times we think of economy is like if you're more efficient, it takes less energy to work at a set physiological work rate or physical work rate. So let's say you're on a treadmill at 6 miles per hour. If you're more efficient than Joe, you would consume less oxygen relative to your body mass at that intensity, right? Or you would expend less energy. So we think of VO2 max, you want to be high. Your submaximal VO2 at any given intensity of exercise, it's ideally to be lower, right, at a given speed or given power output. And so someone who's more economical will consume less oxygen, expend less energy to work at the same physical workload. Now, most people, though, when they run a marathon, or maybe some people want to just say, hey, I've saved energy and this marathon was easier, right? That might be how you run your marathon, Jorge. But people who run the marathon faster don't say, let's just make this easier. They say, let's run faster, right? So the other benefit of economy, the real benefit of economy to performance, is not just trying to save energy at the same speed, but say, hey, I have this sustainable physiological intensity I can do. I can work at this VO2 for this period of time. Now I can go faster at that VO2. That's really the benefit of improved economy. So people have studied running economy for a long period of time in terms of like, training things that you can do, nutritional things you might be able to do, plyos and heavy strength work. And then really the big thing in the last 10 years now has been the role of footwear on impacting running economy.
No, that's a great overview. Thank you so much for that. And I guess so let's transition to one of your first studies on this, where you compare different super shoes. And so tell us, I guess, kind of a quick study design, why you decided to pick the shoes that you did, and big takeaway that you got from there.
Yeah, so it's like if you follow the story of these super shoes from like the 2016 Rio Olympics, where the male podium finishers are all in this new Nike prototype super shoe, and no one really knows at the time like what that is all about. But shortly after that, there's a Nike prototype paper that gets published by Walter Hochhammer and Roger Crom's group that shows this new Nike prototype that happened to be the shoe these guys were wearing improve their running economy by 4%. And so then you say, well, does that make them 4% faster? It's not like a perfectly 1-to-1 ratio in terms of like improving economy leading to velocity improvements, because especially at faster speeds, you get a little bit more like wind resistance at those faster speeds. It's probably like 2/3 of the benefit you see in improved economy, like in a lab setting, should translate to like improvements in velocity. So like if you get a 3% running economy improvement in the lab, that should be 2% faster on the roads. And so yeah, if you go back to 2016, 2017, this like Nike Vaporfly prototype paper comes out where they've got a 4% running economy benefit compared to the other like marathon racing shoes of the time. So really substantial improvement. And one of the things they highlighted in like kind of the materials testing from that paper, from those shoes, was that really highly resilient and compliant foam. And so from that period on, really the focus had been on this Nike shoe, like, who's got this Nike shoe, who's running fast in this Nike shoe. And it was an interesting time period, probably from like 2017 to 2020 in the competitive running world, because you have like guys and girls who were sponsored by different shoe companies who were like maybe running in these Nike shoes with the swoosh torn off or spray painted black, or like to try to like not break their contract, because there was really like no other competitor shoe early on.
Wow.
And then even when these other footwear companies started making their own carbon plated shoes, there wasn't necessarily like the efficacy of like, is it giving people 4% benefit, right? And like the anecdotal evidence, at least based on what people were doing and feeling, was like, maybe the playing field's not level. That was like the strong anecdotal evidence at the time. I think there's one graphic I have in a presentation. I think it's at 2019 World Marathon Majors. Like, of all the World Marathon Majors, like almost all of the podium finishers are wearing this Nike prototype shoe. There's like no diversity among the footwear that's atop of the podium. So yeah, so the consensus or anecdote at the time was like, hey, things maybe aren't level. And I was doing some testing on myself. I've been running forever. I hadn't run marathons up to that point in like 2020, I guess. And I had just trained for like a marathon, and I had this early version of the Hoka carbon plated shoes, the Hoka Carbon X, I think it was. And it was their first iteration. And it had the carbon plate, but it didn't have different foam. And when I first got the shoe, I was like, it was noticeable that the shoe was stiffer. And I like did a whole trainings build in it and cycle, and ran a marathon in it. I bonked in my marathon. I don't blame the shoe for that, but I was about to buy a second version of the shoe, because I was like, okay, this shoe's worn out. I need a new shoe. And I was like, well, maybe I should test myself in the lab, test my running economy in the lab. And so what you do for this running economy testing is it's submaximal, so it's easy to do. You test that speed slower than your threshold so that you can reach like steady state oxygen consumption. And so usually we test with people at like marathon race pace. And
tell us a little bit about that for those. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so
it's a little bit, the steady state and how that works for those that are not familiar with it.
Yeah, so when you if we're measuring oxygen consumption, so I got someone hooked up to a mask and you're measuring their expired gas, and we're indirectly determining caloric expenditure through respiratory gas exchange by measuring oxygen consumption and CO2 production. That aerobic element of like the energy component of your metabolism takes a minute or two to like reach steady state when I put you at a fixed speed on the treadmill. And so we observed that over like a 5-minute window and average the data over like the final 2 minutes. So we're getting like your steady state oxygen consumption for that task. So to do this running economy testing, if we wanted to test 2 shoes, for instance, we just need to do 5 minutes in one shoe, give a 5-minute break just to kind of reach back to baseline, and then 5 minutes in the other shoe. And we typically do that in duplicate. So if we were testing 2 shoes, we would do like 4 by 5-minute trials with 5-minute rest in between, alternating the shoes. And so you can get the average of duplicate trials to kind of limit some of the noise. But because it's submaximal, it's easy to take people in the lab. If you're trying to do a bunch of shoes in one session, then you get limited on like kind of the number fatigue wise, but we can easily get up to like 8 to 10 reps for someone who's helping fit. So yeah, so that's kind of the process of measuring running economy. It's measuring submaximal oxygen consumption at a fixed speed. And with the condition that you're more economical in would be the one where you have a lower VO2 or lower energy expenditure. So I do this testing on myself with this Hoka carbon plated shoe I had been running in, and I just used an old school racing flat that just had, regular EVA foam and no carbon plate and was pretty lightweight, and there was no difference between the 2 shoes when I did this test. So this was kind of my first kind of foray into kind of like case study lab rat testing on myself, right? Just to kind of see pilot testing for like ideas for projects, right? That's one of the things I've always enjoyed about exercise physiology. It's kind of the roots of our field is kind of using grad students around the lab and using yourselves. Like we can go back to like Harvard Fatigue Lab, right? Like that's kind of how things started in our field. So I'm like, okay, well, the anecdote is strong in this, and now I've got some personal physiology data that says, hey, maybe these new generation carbon shoes that aren't from this Nike models, right, aren't doing anything. And so, there's some commentary in our field about like high and low responders to any intervention, and there's some weaknesses to those arguments. But I thought, okay, maybe I'm a non-responder to these shoes, right? I'm just so I picked up the that the Nike's newest super shoe at that time was the Alpha Fly, which similar to like the original Vaporfly, more foam though, and like even these like AirPods under the forefoot. That's the shoe that Kipchoge broke the 2-hour marathon in the exhibition event they did. So I got my hands on one of those shoes and like take them out right out of the box and test them on the treadmill to see if I'm gonna get any benefit from them and decide if I want to return them or not, or waste my money on these things. So, and when I tested those, I was 4% better compared to the other carbon plated shoe. And so I was like, okay, now I got like some real evidence that I am a responder. I'm getting a pretty good benefit out of this shoe. And maybe the tech is not up to snuff across these other brands, right? And so, but yeah, I think from a sports science standpoint, I always think like we don't blindly trust the anecdote, but we should probably follow it and then try to like investigate it. So when you have all these coaches and athletes who are kind of by feel saying, hey, maybe I'm not using this shoe for this reason, like, and then you get a little bit of pilot data to suggest that makes sense as a question that you should maybe pursue. So yeah, so from there, what I did is we got 7 of these carbon plated shoes from different brands. So I got a little mini grant. So it was an independent study from the footwear companies. And I did a lot of these shoes were hard to get at the time. And still some of them like sell out, like these small batch releases from some of the current ones. But I got as many as I could. So we got 7. And you got to get in like a small run of sizes because you can't, have everybody do your study from size 6 to size 12, right? Like it's cost limiting. So,
yeah.
So we had, I think in that first one, 12 subjects come to the lab and test these 7 different shoes and a control shoe. And because we were doing like 8 shoes in that case, we needed to spread it out over 2 visits. So they did 8 shoes in a random order the first day, and then they came back a week or 2 later and did the same 8 shoes just in the opposite order. So you had duplicate trials across all the shoes, and you're still testing every shoe on the same day. So you limit your variability to like within day noise, not between day noise, which is much greater. But yeah, what we showed in that shoe is there was like there was a clear delineation in sort of like the tiers of shoes. All these carbon plated shoes weren't on the same level, and kind of as expected that the 2 Nike shoes we tested were leading the pack. One of the ASICS shoes at the time kind of met that standard, and there were some mid-tier shoes, and then there was a couple that were total duds that were no better than the control shoe. So that pilot testing data I'd done on myself kind of panned out across a group of runners, and we were testing those guys at like 6-minute mile pace. So yeah, so that was kind of eye-opening. That study was popular at the time because it, investigated kind of that anecdote that was out there, and things have changed a lot with the running shoe market since. Like I think the 2 duds in that study were still using EVA foam. All these companies are using PEBA foam or some other more compliant and resilient foam now. I think if we were to redo a study like that now, it would probably see closer margins there, but there's not a lot of brand comparison studies out there. A lot of the footwear researchers are backed by shoe companies, or they do investigations for shoe companies, so it's not a lot of independent researchers that are kind of pitting them against each other. But there's a recent Puma study we can talk about later if we want to get to that later, that kind of how things are changing still.
Yeah. I've got lots of different questions, but I know I've seen Joe kind of writing down some notes and stuff, so I know he's got some questions as well. So I'll let Joe and let you get a little break from speaking and sharing all that. So thank you. That's really exciting, actually. But go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. First, that was just an excellent overview for running economy, just like working through all of those different physiological processes for people that are not familiar with how these tests are done. So I think that's a great start. A few threads to pull on. You highlighted the 3 physiological contributions to performance, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on what Alex Hutchinson has probably popularized, which is sort of the 4th potential component, which is not necessarily physiological, but potentially psychological. And in relating it to this conversation specifically, if in any of these trials, do people look down and see I'm wearing the super shoe during my treadmill test, and then they take it off, they rest, they come back on the treadmill, and they throw on their old running shoes? Could you just kind of speak to that, I guess, broadly from the psychology standpoint, and then specifically in any of those studies, if people were blinded or not to their shoes, and if you have any ideas on whether there's an impact or not?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so because we're measuring a submaximal physiological measure that's objective, I don't think blinding is necessary in the studies, and I could give several reasons why and some actual empirical evidence why. But if we were asking your perceived effort, and that's a subjective measure, then I would have concerns on, oh, you got this fancy shoe on, and you think now you must be easier, right, than when you had this ugly clunker on, right? And we do collect. I've actually not focused on the perceived measures much. A lot of times we collect it, but don't even put it in papers just because, well, one, like you don't get a lot of spread when you ask people like RP stuff doing this kind of testing for it to have much to analyze. But yeah, that would be more of a flawed analysis. You can't lie or you can't cheat your physiology. Like unless you put that shoe on and just started like, oh, this is the clunker, I'm just going to start like running way different, like just being lazy and sloppy, right? But if people are like trying to know what shoe they're best in and they're doing that, we just tell them to run normal, like, run your normal, your normal way in each of these shoes. Yeah, you can't really cheat what's going on cellularly in terms of, oxygen your mitochondria are consuming to produce ADP to give you the muscle contraction and power you need to do that task, right? And so for that reason, I think it's not so much a concern. And there's a recent paper by Kim Aber-Lossier's group where the point of it was that people, if you just ask them the subjective, like it could have been misleading. They did deception. They tricked people, and it was something like both conditions they were running in the super shoe, but they had spray painted them or changed them in some way. And the condition where they told them, hey, this is the good shoe versus this is the bad shoe, they perceived it was easier, right? But their physiology was no different. Like their running economy was no different. And so I think that like solidifies it there. Well, we tended to expect already. And her group, when they did one of the early papers, they had spray painted all the shoes, which some people, the shoe nerds would be up in arms. You're spray painting these $300 shoes. But yeah, so I don't think for these submaximal objective measures, it's necessary to blind. If we were doing some performance testing, it would be more important. I think if we were doing anything that's at like, we're going to go do a time trial, then we want to make sure that you're blinded to the conditions so that it's not impacting your subjective effort that would impact the metric of our interest. So
yeah, that's a very neat study, I guess, to refute that point. And
yeah.
Related to that though, with these shoes, I know there's a lot of different things as far as the drop in the shoe and the thickness, and then also thinking between people who might be more so heel strikers and midfoot strikers. And it could be that in the sample that you tested, from what I've heard with the 6-minute mile pace and being able to do that for close to an hour on and off with breaks, that would require somebody who's probably pretty well trained. So maybe they don't have as much variability, but can you speak to any potential individual differences that may have occurred if one of those shoes have a sort of differential or preferential benefit for somebody with a certain strike pattern?
Yeah. That's like kind of $1 million question, is what determines like individual responsiveness to any kind of intervention, right? But in this case, footwear interventions. And I think, so with the footwear, the foot strike, to your foot strike question, a lot of runners are heel strikers or rear foot strikers, and maybe not like slamming their heel down, but kind of landing on the back edge of the heel and more mid to rear foot, and not really true like forefoot strikers. And so in that first Hillcomer paper, they actually did try to like split out. I think they had a kind of even spread of forefoot and rear foot strikers, and there wasn't any real big differences. Like everybody was getting a benefit. There might have actually been a slightly more benefit in the rear foot strikers. And so I don't think there's been any like real investigations that like really deliberately tried to split those two groups apart. And that's not to say that like footwear companies couldn't manufacture shoes to be more individualized for that. And that's kind of one of the Puma paper that I alluded to that came out recently. They've shown like pretty big improvements in economy compared to what we thought were like the top super shoes on the market that people are like present day super shoes running world records in. And one of the things they did in that is use planar pressure mapping to optimize where they eliminated foam in a material and where they kept it. But it's still, that's one shoe. It's not like it's, 3 versions that they got for different forefoot strikers. They kind of looked at like, hey, your typical person who's running at these paces that we're making these shoes for, like what were their kind of wear pattern through the shoe look like, and kind of optimize that way. So I think that's happening. But in terms of the research slate, I don't know that we've seen anything that like really gives us any clear indication that like, oh, this type of person responds way higher. And there's been a lot of questions on that. Like there's about like, are there super shoe hyper responders? And I get critical on this. I'm going to soapbox on this just in general, because I think if you're looking at any intervention in our field and measuring the outcome of interest, whatever dependent variable you're interested in response to that, there's going to be in a given study like a range of responses, right? And that range of responses is not necessarily indicative of individual responsiveness, because we could do that study again and maybe, Jorge was a 6% benefit guy here, and now the second time we do it, he's a 3% benefit guy, right? But we still have that same bell curve across like all of the subjects in the sample. And so from just a given snapshot, single study, that range of responsiveness cannot be concluded to be like individual responsiveness. You need to have repeated trials of that intervention to see that, or have a control arm to see that. And a lot of times that gets ignored, and we just say, oh, the person who got a 6% benefit in this study is a high responder, and the person who got 2% benefit it's a low responder. And so, yeah, I've been critical, I think, of that in our field in general. I've also been guilty of making that mistake earlier on, I think. So there's some studies in the lit that like have, maybe they only looked at single trials, or they had a bad Met cart that was way noisier. And it's like, oh, these guys got 11% benefit and these guys got 11% decrement. It's like, no one's getting a 20% swing in these shoes. That's like the difference between like military boots and super shoes is still not even going to do that much to you. So that's like a challenge with the individual response question, is we first need to see like what is like the between day variability and the running economy benefit that you get from this footwear. And no one's really done that study yet. It's on my list. I've got a grant out to support that study.
Yeah, well, hopefully it hits. And I do share skepticism as well with the sort of, you do a study in 20 people, there's no benefit to your intervention. So then you just say, okay, well, let's just split it into 10 people who happen to go up a little bit and 10 people who happen to go down a little bit to make a story around it. And yeah, I agree that there's a way to do it correctly, but it needs to be framed in sort of an objective way. And was the study designed to do that? Are these groups truly different for some physiological reason that would sort of predicate why there would be a benefit? So I think it is overused to some extent.
Yeah. Well, and so to get into the weeds on that a bit more, we did a within day reliability testing study. So a lot of people have looked at running economy between day reliability. So like how consistent your Met card is between days. So if we did some sort of intervention, over the course of a couple months of street training or something, and we wanted to measure your running economy pre and post, we want to know the between day reliability of your metabolic cart and measuring your own economy. So some folks have done that study. And as you expect, that variability is higher than if I just test you within day. But no one really had focused on, like what pertains to the footwear, since we're testing everything on the same day, is how consistent the Met cart is between reps on the same day. So like if we just did 4 reps in a control shoe, ideally that difference is 0, but there's not a lot of noise around that as well, right? And so we did that recently. That's published in Footwear Science. One of my grad students back at SFA did that for his thesis, Garrett Ohlert. And as you'd expect, like the difference in a control condition is like 0%, but it's like plus or minus 1% around that. And so if you take kind of this logic of like, there's not a high responder or a low responder to that control condition, right? The person who was plus 1% and minus 1% are not high and low responders. That's just the normal noise around that metric, right? And so if that's like the control arm where you have this plus or minus 1% noise around this metric, you look at in that super shoe study we did, like consistently across the board, everyone's better in these top tier shoes. We couldn't make the statistical conclusions to say that. So we feel good making those group level conclusions, right? But to call someone a high or low responder in that, like, hey, if this shoe gave the group average a 2.8% benefit and that's a plus or minus 1% around that, well, that's the same plus or minus 1% we saw in the control arm, right? And so like, we can't make any conclusions about anyone with that shoe being a high or low responder, because the variability around that mean response matches what we saw in the control arm of the study. And so we have a little bit of insight in that. Those are 2 separate cohorts of people, 2 separate studies, but there was only one shoe in that study we did that had a larger range of responses than what we saw in that control study. So yeah, so I think people jump the gun a bit on like investigating. And then what happens is then you say, okay, well, if we think there's high and low responders, then we go start trying to correlate a bunch of like spurious metrics to that, and you focus on things that maybe don't mean anything, right? And so
yeah, all great points. So I've 2 different directions here. I guess thinking about what you just mentioned with within day reliability and between day, I'm curious I guess we can separate just any shoe in general, what happens over time. So thinking about you're running in the shoe 50 miles a week, what happens when you run in that shoe on day 1? And if you could somehow sort of, let's say this person's been doing this for years, so they're not necessarily improving, they're just maintaining fitness, economy, everything. What type of detriment, if any, to economy would you expect from a running shoe through typical use? I know there's different sort of anecdotes out there with, 200, 300, 500 miles is the life of a shoe. What kind of insights do you have on that, if any?
Yeah, so with the super shoes, there's one published paper I can think of. I think it's Victor Rodrigo Carranza, with some On shoes, where they actually like took a pair of On super shoes, tested them and they had a fresh pair, and then they had a pair that they like wore for a couple 100 kilometers or something, and then they compared the fresh pair to the control pair. There were some limitations in that paper. I have to look back at it, but they showed in that time window like deterioration of the benefits. I'm not convinced like that's probably the case for all shoes. There's different foams across these different companies, and like I said, I have to look back at that specific paper, but like from personal testing. So I've got this pair of Alpha Flies that have like got up to, I think, like 300 miles and pretty much had hardly any decrement in the run economy benefit. So like that original Alpha Fly shoe usually hits right around 4% for me, in that this is like compared to standard control shoe I use. That's another challenge comparing studies across lit, is like no one has the same standard control shoe. So at least in like my lab research and my case study testing, I always have the same control shoe. But if that Alpha Fly usually hits at like 4%. When I had like 300 miles plus on it, it was still right around that. So I think they're actually pretty good in terms of like their longevity. Some of the materials testing, a colleague of mine, Jeff Burns, who's at U.S. Olympic Training Center and does some work still as adjunct faculty at University of Michigan, but he's got a mechanical engineering background and has done some of the materials testing stuff in terms of compliance and resilience testing. And he'd probably say similarly from some of these PIBA shoes he's tested, materials testing wise, like a lot of those properties in terms of compliance and resilience holds up pretty good over several hundred miles. So I think they do okay.
What you're saying is that I no longer have an excuse not to run because I want to keep my the foam on my shoes compliant. So yeah, okay, I gotta start hitting the road.
Yeah, your super shoes, I guess. I mean, I think these shoes are expensive, right? So like your runner who buys a $300 pair of shoes and it's like, should I use them for my workouts? I don't want to wear them down too much, or I'm going to use them just for races. Like, what point do I retire? I'm going to need a new one. Yeah. I think you got several hundred miles life in them. That's going to vary across brands. Adidas came out with this $500 shoe that they said was only good for one race, and they were like, "What?" Now I think it probably lasts longer, and that was a weird marketing blunder, maybe. But it also probably depends on how some of these shoes are like foamed out, like the air between like the cells of foam, and how much they get kind of squashed out. So it gets into a lot of like the chemical engineering, materials engineering. Which is beyond my physiology background.
Yeah, an anecdote that's really interesting that you bring it, Joe, that you brought up that and your explanation, Dustin, on that. One of the runners from actually a College Station running shoe store, something that he said, it was just like, you need to use them. If you just don't use them, the foam actually kind of deteriorates by just, sitting there and not being utilized. So kind of use it or lose it, kind of a anecdote that he said. How true that is, I don't know. So we're throwing a lot of different numbers, percentages, and improvement in running economy and so forth. And for those that are not competitive racers, they might think, okay, 2%, 3%, 4%, that doesn't sound like much. How does that translate into the real world? Maybe a race, as far as time or distance.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna do some mental math here.
If you got
the easy translation is at the faster speeds, like the easy rule of thumb is like 2/3 of the running economy benefit, like I said, ends up being velocity improvement. So let's say you get a 3% running economy benefit in the lab. That theoretically translates to around 2% velocity improvement. So 2% on 60-minute long race is 1.2 minutes. Is that right? 60 times. So yeah, over a 3-hour race, you're getting up closer to 4 or 5 minutes at that point, right? So pretty substantial improvement when you think about the amount of work people do to try to improve a marathon time, especially at the elite fringes, right? Like to try to improve your marathon time by a minute at that level is insane, right? But even for someone doing like a 3-hour marathon, shaving off 5-10 minutes is. So yeah, if someone's getting 5-6% benefit out of a shoe, that's a big time game changer, and that pans out. If you look at the performance data, since 2016, pretty much every world record on the roads and in distance races on the track, because this shoe tech is in track spikes now as well. Every world record from basically for women 1,500 and up, for men everything over 1,500 and up has been broken.
Yeah, which is, it seems like every year, right? Like, new record. And it makes me kind of think of back in the day, Jesse Owens in, what was it, 1936 or so forth? I forgot what the year that Olympics was for the 100-meter record. So David Epstein, the author of the Sports Gene, he has a really good TED Talk, and I'll maybe link to it here on the show notes. But he talks about athletes getting faster, bigger, stronger kind of thing. So I thought it was really interesting because he was comparing the track on itself. It used to be, I think like cinder ash that they used to run in. And so when you look at Jesse Owens' record on the 100-meter dash, it was like, I think he ran a 10.2 seconds. And you compare that to, again, at the time, 2012 or so, Usain Bolt ran I think it was a 9.77 seconds. But if you account for the difference in with the track, the improvements of just the track itself and the blocks, right? Now you have this block that you're able to push off. Basically, the difference was 14 feet when you look at the absolute data, but whenever you account for those differences in technology, it would have been just one stride length. And so it kind of makes me think of, okay, what if you put these types of shoes on athletes like Jesse Owens or people back then? I wonder if there's anybody that's looked at any kind of data and kind of normalized for that and see kind of what those records would have been back in the day.
Yeah, no, it's a fun question. And like as a sports fan and athletics fan, it's one you grapple with in terms of like trying to understand kind of the magnitude of a performance, right? A breakthrough. And I think that's for a lot of the purists, that's been a frustration with the super shoes is like, oh, are they fair? And it's like, well, fairness is a question of like multiple levels. Like, does everyone have access to the shoe? If everyone has access to the shoe present day, then maybe things are fair, right? Early on, maybe that wasn't the case, but I think you can make an argument that access has been equalized. So then, is it fair to make comparisons present to past? Probably not. But that's, as you point out, like there's technological advancements all over sport, not just in athletics. Look at golf clubs and tennis rackets, and there's rare cases where sport governing bodies have like stopped the progress of sports tech, right? Like you can look at, I like the example of in swimming, like 2009 World Championships, like every record goes down, or that year, every record goes down in swimming with those like full length textile swimsuits that were being worn.
The shark
and
skins,
FINA ended up banning those. Yeah. They were more buoyant and slipstream and they're full body length. And FINA ended up actually banning those and going back to just the regular half tights for guys, right? But present day, pretty much all those records have been broken since from that 2009 year, all the ones that people would have kind of had the asterisk on. I think there's maybe one left. I don't follow swimming records as much, but I think that's just kind of examples like, so how much is normal human advancement? How much is the sports tech? I think it's something you got to grapple with. I think as a sports scientist, for me, I think of these improvements as like, yes, I'm interested in the exercise physiology research on optimizing training and recovery. And that's all kind of pure to the athlete, right? And like, are we making athletes better by training smarter and all? But just as much, I appreciate like, hey, this is a collective team effort on the nutrition end and the sports tech end and the engineering end. And I think like people who, when Kipchoge broke 2 hours for the marathon and that exhibition style event, I saw some people compare it to like, oh, it's like putting the first man on the moon, right? And it's like, that wasn't just a single effort of that human who's jumped off the spaceship onto the moon, right? It was like the collective effort of the engineering and the physiology and all that. And so I think that's cool and neat. I think sport governing bodies should have some rules in place to like make sure that the playing field is level at this point in time, which I think World Athletics has tried to do. So these shoe advancements we talked about, the big change that's taken place into the regulations is they've limited like the stack height, how tall the shoe can be at 40 millimeters for road racing, and limited the amount of like stiffening elements that can be in the shoe. So basically like a single carbon fiber plate in one plane, you can't have them like sandwiched around things. And so they put some rules in place to kind of like limit where innovation can occur. And so some people say, hey, don't have any rules at all, let innovation like be maximized.
Yeah.
But at least there's sort of something setting the bounds now. But yeah, I'm not so much of a purist to think like, oh, well, this is cheapening everything. But it does make it hard to compare like what is like a generational talent and like a extreme record. And I think the other thing people grapple with is like in the age of doping, which doping's been an issue since forever as well. But it makes it hard to know like when are you seeing a legitimate improvement or one that's illegitimate, right? Like, I mean, you just had in Chicago 2 years ago, the women's world marathon record go under 2:10. And a lot of people at the time called BS on that and thought, man, this has got to be doping, right? And people grapple with, oh, maybe the shoe's just better. Maybe she's a hyper responder to the shoe, right? Well, it turned out she was doping, but yeah, that's a challenge. That's a challenge with kind of any kind of sports tech advancement, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I share similar views on that point as you do. The other follow-up questions that I wanted to ask was, whenever you were having these individuals, you had them running at a certain speed, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, I've been kind of couch potato recently. There's no way, even with the super shoe, that I'm going to be able to go out there and start just running at a certain speed to be able to get these types of benefits. So, which leads me to your other paper that you've published on the differences in speed. So tell us a little about how speed affects the running economy, and if I do use the super shoe, do I need to go faster for me to get the best benefit?
Yeah, so I like asking sort of consumer-driven questions, especially as like an independent researcher, like not tied to a footwear company. And so that was one of the big questions, kind of as a follow-up, was most of the work on these super shoes had been done at like 6-minute mile pace and faster, 7-minute mile pace and faster on the slow end. But that's all like 3-hour marathoners and faster, right? And if you look at even at like competitive world marathon majors, like at Boston, like maybe 20% of the field is doing that, right? So you have a huge swath of the running shoe market, recreational competitive runner market that's not running that fast, right? And so that study you referred to, we looked at the benefits of a advanced footwear technology shoe or super shoe against the same control shoe at 10 and 12 kilometers per hour. So that corresponds to like 3.5-hour marathon to like a 4:15 marathon, which is still really respectable times for, age groupers doing marathons. And so we showed there a reduction in the magnitude of benefit. So whereas in those previous studies across the lit, like probably seeing like 2.7 to 4% benefit in running economy at those faster speeds we'd seen tested before, the magnitude of benefit here for that like 12 kilometer hour pace was maybe 1.5%. At the 10 kilometer per hour place was maybe like just under a percentage point. So still meaningful benefit. The other thing we saw in that study is it wasn't like 100% of people across the board were better in the super shoe. So in those other studies at the faster speeds, pretty much everyone has been better in the super shoe. Now there's a range of responses. We talked about individual responsiveness, but everybody was better in the super shoe, which is pretty convincing evidence, right? Especially when the shoes are mass matched in those kind of studies. So, but in this, with a mass match shoe at that slowest speed for like the 4:15 marathon equivalent, probably like a third of the subjects were actually worse in the super shoe. So kind of gets to this, like, conclusions from that would be, I think there are benefits to be had at slower speeds in those ranges we tested there, but they might be reduced in magnitude. And I wouldn't like 100% assume someone's going to be better in one versus just because, right?
Thank you for that. Joe, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, just following up on that. Do you think that's just purely mathematical from the ground reaction force that is pushed into the shoe? So you sort of have two people, one person pushes X amount of force into a spring for very basic science, and you can kind of correct the spring analogy, and you get some amount of that back. But if you have person B push half as much force into that, then the reaction, and especially that reaction in relation to a normal shoe without as much of that sort of reactive component of the foam, do you think is sort of kind of basically mathematically explained? And maybe you could even measure this though, because you might even have, aside from speed, I don't know how much variability there is between speed and ground reaction force, but it seems like you could almost test that kind of individually.
Yeah. So that's one of the things we hypothesized in that paper. In that paper, so I'm a physiologist, so when I try to explain the biomechanics too much, I usually call a buddy to get on the paper with me, right? But that was one of our hypotheses in that paper. We were just testing on a regular treadmill, so we didn't have ground reaction forces or anything. We do have like some running mechanics data that we can try to extrapolate, but we had a pretty lightweight group in that study, and they also ran at relatively high cadences. Half the subjects were women, half the subjects were men in that study, but they ran at relatively high cadences. So like kind of lower on the lower end of ground reaction forces when you put those things together. So that was one of our hypotheses, that the combination of the slower speed, lighter subjects, faster cadence. Yeah, if you're looking at this thing as a spring, you only can get out what you put in, right? And so if you're putting less force into it, maybe you're not compressing all that foam. So that was one of our hypotheses. I think it's more difficult. You can measure the ground reaction forces certainly with anyone who's got a force measuring instrument, a treadmill, but actually like quantifying real time how much the shoe is deforming, right? Like they can take that to the materials testing in and try to mimic those forces as much as they can to like the real gait forces, but it's not the easiest thing to do, I think. That was one of our hypotheses. Yeah, there's some other research that looked at like at slower speeds and lower forces, that longitudinal bending stiffness that like kind of what's the ideal longitudinal bending stiffness provided by that carbon plate can differ. And so if the shoe's too stiff, that might not be ideal at like those lower speeds and forces. So yeah, that was kind of our two thinking points there. So I tried doing a follow-up, but so I was in Austin for a few years at my last university, and I'm not at UT Austin, but at a little liberal arts school nearby. And we did a little collaborative project with Owen Beck over there in his biomechanics lab, and didn't get through enough subjects. But that was one of my hypotheses, was like, okay, what if we recruit a really heavy group? So we recruited like runners that are 180 pounds plus and runners that were 130 pounds and lighter. And when we looked at the same two shoes at that slow speed to try to see like, was there a difference in the benefit between those two groups? And there's like some trends, but I only have 8 and 8. So it's like, but so many of these run economy studies, the designs are great because it's within day, within subject, huge effect sizes. You can make good conclusions with like 8 to 12 people, right, for this running economy data. But now we're going between subjects, more variability and noise. And so we have 8 and 8 in that sample that I have. And I see some trends there, but like there's more going on. You know, if you get one light rate runner who runs really loping, you know, he might break that mold, or, you know, there's so many other like confounding variables in that. But I think when I kind of did like some of the sample size estimate from that pilot data, it's like, you know, if we probably had 20 plus in each group there, we'd probably see something like that. From some of the initial effects we're seeing there, but it's just not as clear cut. There's so much other stuff going on with people's gait, how they interact with the shoe, that I think just weight alone maybe doesn't explain it. But I do think there's probably something to that. And I think there's something to the faster, slower speed thing, even across some other studies that have been done in the lit. But that's not to say footwear companies couldn't try to like make a shoe that would be more ideal for, you know, different forces or different paces and so on.
That's a perfect segue, that last part. And you had kind of started to talk on the individualized shoes from that Puma study you mentioned. So I guess one initial question, which is sort of just a yes, no, if you're an elite ultra endurance or just endurance athlete, and you said that you wanted an individualized shoe that was sort of fit to your, not only the size and shape of your foot, but also your strike pattern, and even more so down to, do you have more force in internal or external part of your foot? And so can you get access to a shoe like that? So if like me and Jorge went to a running store and we said we're going to compete in this, you know, race, and we're expected to be top 5 finishers, and, you know, Jorge wants a shoe that's a little bit like this and I want a shoe a little bit like that. So is that something that can be done? And if not, I guess how close are we to doing that? And just any kind of thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm still a footwear industry outsider. You know, I've got relationship with different footwear company folks and like some product development team people and stuff, you know, but I'm by no means an insider on that front to like really answer that question. I think that's going to be pretty niche to like their top elite athletes. Like, and one of the rules that World Athletics has is that in addition to that stack height rule and single carbon plate rule, is that a shoe has to be commercially available. So it's actually, for those elites, isn't even legal to have like your own prototype that no one else has access to. It's got to be a commercially available shoe. And, you know, a lot of what the footwear companies do is going to be driven by, can we sell this shoe? And so they've got to, they try to individualize, I think, to like some homogenous group, but, and maybe like, hey, if, you know, we've seen this in this group of our runners and this in our other group of runners, we get 2 shoes in our lineup now for them to choose from. So it's probably more along those lines. Could they make 100% individualized optimal? Maybe, but that's probably beyond my insights.
Yeah, and and you may not know the answer to this, and I certainly have not read the rule book on any of this, but for commercially available, I'm thinking, you know, could someone just come out with a shoe that says this is a $5,000 shoe, and to get it, you have to go to one of these 40 shoe stores across the country, get your individualized, you know, force and treadmill testing, biomechanic testing, and, you know, from there it is commercially available.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know where the rules.
No, that is one of the rules that I'm critical of, and that I think doesn't have as much teeth. Maybe I don't. Yeah, because like even that Adidas shoe, that $500 Adidas shoe, when it first came out, it was like really small batch production and like nearly impossible to get. But, and then you got, I mean, most elites are sponsored by a footwear company, so they're kind of locked into a model anyway. So yeah, there's some criticism maybe of like how that rule gets enforced, but they do have a system now, like where you can actually look on World Athletics site and see shoes that are like in prototype status and like their preliminary approvals and these sorts of things. So they're doing more there for sure. I'm always questioned too. There's like the stack height rule is over like on a set size that they send in for testing. And it's like, well, what if just in your other size, it's like changed that and manipulated that? But I guess things are subject to like test in competition too if they really want to do that. But
Yeah, and then I'm probably getting a little wild here, but I mean, socks. Could you throw some foam on the bottom of your socks? I mean, to get that extra millimeter, or I don't know.
yeah, well, that'd be a question of like, is it really that open and shut case that more foam is better? That might not always be the case, right? Especially if it's not integrated to like the rest of the geometry of the shoe. I mean, there's actually been a few studies, like one actually looking at like, oh, hey, here's this 50, 60 millimeter shoe. And look, economy, when you don't mass match it, when you face the fact that if you have more foam, you also have to carry that extra mass around. So when you don't mass match that, there's no further benefit compared to like the 40 millimeter. And so that the people who did that study made the argument that, hey, maybe we shouldn't have these rules, right? But they tested at really slow speeds in that study, which was one criticism there. And then there's a recent paper out actually from On where they did have a higher stack shoe, like 50 millimeters or so plus, and they tested at pretty fast speeds in that study, and they showed that people were better off in that higher stack one. So I think that kind of fits into our theory on the speeds and foam deformation thing, right? I think that's actually, that On study was actually the shoe. When Blumenfeld won Ironman World Championships a few years back, and he was in a shoe that then subsequently got banned. Like it was legal when he used it, but I think the triathlon regulations have like matched world athletic regulations now, so that shoe wouldn't be legal anymore. But so yeah, I think jury's still out on some of that. But yeah, it's probably more complicated than just adding extra foam, and there's probably some diminishing return at some point with extra mass and less lateral stability in the shoe and those sorts of things.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Jorge, you got some questions?
Yeah, well, I'm going to play devil's advocate. And Joe, I like the way you think. I had similar questions, but I'm going to take it the opposite way for you, Dustin. And I know you and I have talked about the Born to Run book before. And so for those of you that are not familiar with that, that's a book talking about barefoot running, basically looking at the Tarahumara or Raramuri tribe in northern Mexico and Chihuahua. And there's been documentaries about looking at the physiology because they're like really high altitude wise. But these runners are consistently, and I don't know any of the top of my head, numbers, names for numbers, but you see it all the time where they show up to a race and they're in their traditional clothing and they're wearing these huaraches or like the homemade sandals that they use. No super shoe, no nothing. And they're blowing out other competitors on these super shoes out of the water. So curious on your thoughts on that. And like you said, looking at this, is just physiology just gonna outperform any kind of technology that is out there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you got, I would argue the premise initially, maybe.
Sure. Yeah. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. So
I don't,
please go ahead.
I don't discount like on the surface, like this idea that, minimalist footwear, barefoot, let your foot be a foot, do the things it's supposed to do in terms of absorbing shock and acting as like a spring through the Achilles and your plantar flexors and so on. So I don't discount that. I think there's benefit from doing some work that way. That spurred the whole barefoot running movement where you had everybody going running minimalist shoes and someone getting off the couch overweight, running in 5 fingers and getting metatarsal stress fractures, and any overload that's not progressive and you don't adapt to, right, can be a stress stimulus that's like you're not ready for. So even if that's how we're naturally meant to be jumping that direction, you haven't accumulated the load on those tissues that way like your Tarahumara have, maybe, right? I guess the part of the premise I would challenge would be I don't see any Tarahumara running in sandals winning world marathon majors, and I don't think we're ever going to see that, right? I don't think we're ever going to see in the modern age of footwear, advanced footwear technology, someone winning a world marathon major in minimalist footwear. That they wouldn't have done better in these high stack super shoes. And so I think it's kind of two sides there, right? Like and we kind of in sports science and health research, we kind of like go on opposites ends of the continuum, right? Oh, you have to be all minimalists or all super shoe, right? They're like, this is a continuum, right? Like, could you get benefits from running some in a minimalist footwear, right? And strengthening your feet and strengthening your Achilles and those sorts of things? Sure, probably so, right? I think, Irene Davis has got a lot of research on that front, right? But are the benefits pretty clear cut that these shoes are improving run economy and performance? Absolutely. Like, and that's not changing, right? So yeah, I would say there's probably a time and a place for any of those things, but we're not all barefoot. We're not all maximalist. There's a variety of ways you can simulate those tissues and train and perform.
Yeah. And no, that's a great answer. I like it. And again, I'm playing devil's advocate on that. But, one of the points as you're giving that explanation, the tribe does, they're known for chasing their prey, right? They hunt by tiring the deer. They really just go for long distances until the animals get tired, and then they trap it, right? So most of us that are having a regular job and things like that, we're definitely not running those kind of distances. So that definitely plays a adaptation component to it. So I guess, as we're kind of wrapping up here, somebody who's wanting to start, what would you recommend as far as what they should focus on for their training? I know you mentioned earlier you would have focused more on preventative injury. And should they invest in a pair of shoes like this right off the bat, or does it really matter? What would you advise?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And my lens has mostly been on the performance end. So we're looking at like these super shoes, running economy, velocity improvements, performance improvements. But footwear is something that any runner is going to interact with. So whether it be one of these super shoes or just a standard training shoe, I don't think it's a bad idea for someone who's running more to like invest in a good quality running shoe. I'm an advocate still for like going to your local specialty run store, and they've got a variety of inventory of like higher quality just shoes that and with some staff there that could help you like try some different options that might work for you based on your needs. And that's changed a lot. That's a whole nother story in terms of like how people have been fitted for shoes and spec for shoes at specialty run shops from pronation control and supination, and that's kind of out the window now in terms of some evidence-based stuff. But I still think that's a good starting point to like try on some different options, kind of use comfort as a guide for just a training shoe. And then, I think principles that we all kind of follow as exercise physiologists in terms of progressive overload and specificity of training, and would apply to someone like, progressing that way is, start out pretty easy. I think a lot of people running sucks for a lot of people, because when you start running, you're like immediately over threshold, and like you can't do that for very long and you fatigue quickly. So like, from a training standpoint, like progressing with run walk, like people can go pretty fast average times just progressing run walk. So like maybe you start out jogging a minute, walking a minute, and then you start building up that running time to maybe get up to 9 minutes on 1 minute walk, and listening to your body, like you're overloading those tissues initially, like backing off, taking to running every other day, every 3 days, and doing another type of cardiovascular training in between so you can like improve your fitness. So I think kind of common things we might recommend as exercise physiologists would apply for someone progressing there too, but probably not getting too caught up in all of the noise of like, oh, I got to have this $300 shoe. Find something that's comfortable and works for you. Don't focus on all the nutrition trends or whatever's going on at the time too. Like just keep it simple. Probably a good bet.
I really like that advice. I actually remember whenever I started running for my half marathon, I was starting to get some shin splints, and because I was trying to go too fast, too quickly, right? So I remember you telling me like, hey, just do some run walks and, listen to the body. So Joe, any last questions or comments?
No, I think that was a great wrap up for recommendations.
Appreciate it, Dustin. And I guess last thing for you, is there anything that we might have maybe missed that you want to share, or do you want to kind of just point out, or anything exciting that you're working on that doesn't have to do with a super shoe or maybe some new super shoe stuff?
No, I think we had pretty good coverage. I mean, I've got some other projects. We've tried to look at the efficacy outside of the lab, actually on the roads, and then now this tech is in trail shoes. So we've actually done some work on trail shoes, and we got a couple papers under review in that regard now. But yeah, kind of following the current trends and things. There's a lot of little fun student projects I have in the works, but no, I think we had pretty good coverage on the topic.
Awesome. Well, we'd love to have you back and share whenever that paper gets published, share kind of what your findings are. Thank you so much for your time again, sharing all your knowledge, insights with us. And for those of you guys that are listening, if you found this helpful, remember to share, like, and give us a follow. So until then, keep asking questions, stay curious, and keep unraveling physiology.